The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the narrow streets outside my apartment into rivers of reflected streetlight. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, my laptop balanced on a stack of art books, trying to focus on the logo design that was due tomorrow morning. The client had rejected my first two concepts, and now I was staring at a blank canvas, cursor blinking mockingly at me in the white void of Photoshop. My apartment felt smaller than usual tonight. The walls seemed to press inward, painted that particular shade of off-white that landlords use to disguise years of damage. My single desk lamp cast a warm pool of light across my workspace, but beyond its reach, shadows gathered in the corners like old secrets. The radiator hissed and clanked, a familiar rhythm that usually comforted me, but tonight it only emphasized how alone I was. I had been alone for 6 months now. 6 months since the argument. 6 months since I had decided that some bridges were better burned than crossed. The knock came sharp and urgent, 3 deliberate raps that cut through the steady drumming of rain against my windows. I froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night. Normal people didn't just show up at this hour, especially not in weather like this. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. My car was parked 3 blocks away, and anyone standing at my door wouldn't be able to see the light from my desk lamp unless they pressed their face against the window. I could stay perfectly still, wait for whoever it was to give up and leave. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. I saved my work and closed the laptop, the sudden darkness making the apartment feel even smaller. My bare feet were silent against the floor as I made my way to the door, stepping carefully around the stack of design magazines I had been meaning to organize for weeks. The peephole revealed nothing but darkness and the distorted shape of someone standing under the flickering porch light. I had been meaning to ask my landlord to fix that bulb for months, but like most things in my life lately, I had simply learned to live with the inconvenience. When I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Ezra Calloway stood on my doorstep, soaked through to the bone. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, water dripping from the ends in steady streams. The blue sweater I remembered him wearing to Professor Martinez's critiques was now several shades darker, clinging to his frame in a way that made him look smaller somehow, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. The streetlight behind him created a halo effect, casting his face in sharp relief against the darkness. His lips were pale, trembling slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else entirely. His eyes, those same green eyes that had challenged me across every classroom we had shared, now looked hollow, desperate. My first instinct was to slam the door. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to close it, lock it, and pretend this moment had never happened. This was the person I had spent 6 months learning to hate. This was Ezra Calloway, who had made my life a competition I never wanted to enter, who had pushed me to my breaking point in the fluorescent-lit silence of the library that night in February. But I stood there, door half open, rain beginning to spatter against my feet, and I couldn't move. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. It cracked on the edges, revealing something raw and unguarded that I had never heard from him before. He said he didn't know where else to go. The words hung in the air between us, mixing with the sound of rain on concrete and the distant hum of late-night traffic. I could see him shivering now, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that made my chest tighten despite myself. This was the boy who had once stood up in our design theory seminar and systematically dismantled my presentation, pointing out every flaw with surgical precision while the rest of the class watched in uncomfortable silence. This was the person who had beaten me for the position of editor for the student magazine, who had won the scholarship I needed, who had made me feel like I was constantly fighting for space in my own life. But standing here in my doorway, water pooling at his feet, he looked nothing like the confident rival I had built up in my mind. He looked like someone who was about to shatter. I found myself stepping back, creating space for him to enter, even as my mind raced with all the reasons this was a terrible idea. The smart thing would have been to ask him what he wanted, to demand an explanation, to maintain the careful distance I'd spent months constructing between us. Instead, I watched him cross the threshold into my apartment, bringing with him the smell of rain and something else, something that reminded me of the coffee shop where we used to study, back when we were still pretending to be friends. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing us both inside the golden circle of lamplight. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, but suddenly the sound felt different, less like isolation and more like being wrapped in something protective, cut off from the rest of the world. He stood in the center of my small living room, dripping water onto the rug I had bought at a thrift store my freshman year, and for the first time in 6 months, the apartment didn't feel empty. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for him to explain himself, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for this moment to reveal itself as another one of his calculated moves in whatever game we had been playing since we first met. But he just stood there, trembling and soaked, and looking like he was carrying the weight of something too heavy for his shoulders, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I had been keeping carefully locked away since that night in February. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of water dripping from his clothes and the steady rhythm of rain against glass. I could see him trying to gather himself, trying to find the words that would make sense of why he was here, why he had chosen my door out of all the doors in this small college town. And despite everything that had happened between us, despite the carefully constructed wall of resentment I had built, I found myself hoping he would find those words, hoping he would give me a reason to let him stay. My world had become deliberately small in the months after the argument. This college town, with its narrow streets that flooded when it rained too hard, had always felt temporary to me, a place to pass through on the way to something bigger. But after February, I had carved out a careful existence within its borders, learning the geography of avoidance. The town stretched along 3 main arteries, each one lined with coffee shops that stayed open too late and businesses that changed hands every semester. There was Meridian Books, where the owner let students camp out for hours over single cups of coffee, and the Underground, a basement venue where local bands played to audiences of 20. Peeling posters layered the brick walls downtown like urban sediment, advertising poetry readings and art shows and protests that had already happened. I had mapped every place Ezra might appear and learned to avoid them all. The campus library after 10 at night, the coffee shop on 5th Street where he liked to write, the vintage record store where I had once found him flipping through jazz albums with the kind of focused attention most people reserve for prayer. My life had become a series of careful detours, routes planned around the possibility of accidentally running into someone I was trying to forget. My apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house, the kind of place that looked charming from the street but revealed its true nature once you climbed the creaking stairs. The landlord had painted everything the same neutral beige, as if personality might damage the property value. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person, with appliances from the 80s and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly but kept my groceries cold enough. But I had made it mine in small ways. Books stacked in precarious towers against every wall, art supplies organized in coffee cans on my desk, a single good lamp that I had splurged on during my sophomore year. My portfolio pieces were tacked to a corkboard above my bed, designs that represented late nights and too much caffeine and the slow process of learning to trust my own instincts. The bathroom doubled as my laundry room, clothes draped over the shower rod and radiator, creating a humid maze that smelled like detergent and the lavender fabric softener my mother had insisted on buying in bulk. It was cramped and imperfect, but it was mine. The one place in the world where I could exist without performance, without competition, without the constant awareness that someone might be judging my choices. Everything about my life had become an exercise in self-containment. I took freelance design jobs that let me work from home, communicating with clients through email and video calls that kept human interaction safely mediated by screens. I bought groceries at odd hours when the store was nearly empty. I had learned to cook for one, to eat dinner standing at my kitchen counter while reading, to fall asleep to the sound of rain or traffic instead of conversation. It was Ezra who had taught me to be competitive, though I doubt he realized it at the time. When I first arrived on campus, I had been content to blend into the background, to complete assignments and collect grades without drawing attention to myself. But he had a way of making everything feel like a contest, raising his hand in seminars with observations that were always just a little sharper than everyone else's, submitting portfolio pieces that made the rest of us look like amateurs. I told myself I hated the way he could command a room, the way professors seemed to lean forward when he spoke, as if his opinions carried more weight than the rest of ours. But somewhere along the way, I had started pushing back, started matching his intensity with my own, started caring about things I had never bothered to care about before. Our rivalry had developed its own ecosystem. We would sit on opposite sides of classrooms, presenting conflicting interpretations of the same assignment, our arguments stretching long past the official end of class. Other students learned to expect it, the way you learn to expect certain weather patterns. Julian and Ezra at it again. The night everything changed, we had been alone in the library's top floor, the place where graduate students went to hide from undergraduates, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects. It was past midnight, and we were both researching the same topic for competing papers. The tension that had been building all semester finally snapped, voices rising in whispers that somehow felt louder than shouting. He accused me of copying his ideas, of following him to the same sources, and twisting his research to fit my arguments. I accused him of being territorial and arrogant, of treating intellectual collaboration like a zero-sum game. The words we exchanged that night were the kind that changed the shape of a relationship permanently, revealing things that can never be taken back. After that, silence. 6 months of it, careful and complete. I convinced myself I preferred it this way. The constant pressure to be better, sharper, more original had been exhausting. Without Ezra as my unwilling measuring stick, I could work at my own pace, follow my own interests, stop looking over my shoulder to see if someone was gaining ground. But standing in my apartment now, watching him drip rainwater onto my thrift store rug, I realized how much energy I had been spending on avoidance, how much of my world had been organized around the absence of this one person. The knock at my door had cracked something open, some carefully maintained barrier between the life I had built and the life I had been living before. My sanctuary suddenly felt less like protection and more like a cage, and the person I had been trying so hard to forget was standing in the center of it, shivering and vulnerable and completely disrupting the careful equilibrium I had spent months constructing. For the first 10 minutes, he didn't explain himself. He just stood there in my living room, creating a small puddle on the hardwood floor, his eyes taking in the controlled chaos of my apartment, as if he were cataloging evidence of how I had been living without him. I found myself moving around him carefully, the way you might navigate around a piece of furniture that had been unexpectedly delivered to the wrong room. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom, stepping over the stack of design magazines, and handed it to him without meeting his eyes. He murmured something that might have been thanks, his voice still rough around the edges. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the sound of him rubbing the towel through his hair and the continued drumming of rain against my windows. I busied myself with making tea, filling my electric kettle, and retrieving 2 mugs from the cabinet, movements automatic and precise. The familiar ritual gave my hand something to do, while my mind raced through scenarios, trying to predict what he wanted, what this visit would cost me. When I finally turned around, he was sitting on my couch, the towel draped around his shoulders like a makeshift blanket. His sweater was still damp, clinging to his frame, and I could see him shivering slightly despite his attempts to control it. That's when he finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. His roommate had kicked him out. Not temporarily, not in the heat of an argument that would blow over by morning, but permanently. There had been accusations about unpaid bills, about borrowed money that hadn't been returned, about late nights and loud music, and all the small ways that people living too close together could learn to hate each other. He didn't ask for pity when he told me this. His voice remained steady, matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather or the results of a midterm exam. But I could hear the exhaustion underneath, the weight of someone who had been carrying a problem alone for longer than he should have. He said he needed a place to sleep for one night, just until he could figure out his next move, until he could call in favors or find a friend with a couch or convince someone in the housing office to make an exception to their policies. Every rational part of my brain told me to say no, to offer him a number for a cheap motel across town, to suggest he try the campus emergency housing fund, to maintain the careful boundaries I'd spent 6 months constructing. We weren't friends anymore. We barely knew each other outside the context of academic competition and hurt feelings. But looking at him sitting there, smaller somehow than I remembered, holding the mug of tea like it was the first warm thing he had touched in days, I heard myself saying yes. One night became 2, then 3, then a week. We developed an awkward choreography around each other, learning to share the narrow hallway and single bathroom with the careful politeness of strangers. He slept on my couch, his presence marked by a neatly folded blanket each morning and the faint scent of his soap in the bathroom. We exchanged clipped words, conversations that never extended beyond the practical necessities of cohabitation. He thanked me for the coffee I made in the morning. I told him which shelf in the shower was mine. We divided the refrigerator space with invisible lines, his food on the left, mine on the right, like roommates who had never chosen to live together. But small things began to shift between us. On Thursday evening, I came home from a client meeting to find him in my kitchen, standing over 2 pots on the stove. He looked up when I walked in, almost guilty, and explained that his grocery budget wouldn't stretch far enough for separate meals. Would I mind sharing dinner? The pasta was nothing special, just something from a box with Jared sauce and whatever vegetables we had between us, but we ate it sitting on my living room floor with our backs against the couch, plates balanced on our knees. I had put on music to fill the silence, a playlist I had made months ago and forgotten about, and when a song came on that we both knew, I caught him smiling. It was a small smile, the kind that appeared and disappeared quickly, but it was the first genuine expression I had seen from him since he had shown up at my door. For a moment, he looked like the person I remembered from before everything went wrong, before competition and pride and hurt feelings had built walls between us. The next evening, he helped me carry boxes to my car for a client project, portfolio cases and presentation materials that would have taken me 3 trips on my own. He didn't complain about the rain or ask questions about where we were going. He just appeared beside me when I was struggling with the heavier items, wordlessly taking half the load. When we got back to the apartment, I found myself mending a small rip in his jacket, the kind of tear that happens when you brush too close to a chain-link fence. My sewing skills were basic at best, learned from necessity and YouTube tutorials, but I worked carefully, aware that he was watching me from across the room. These small exchanges felt significant in ways I couldn't quite articulate. We were learning to exist in the same space without the sharp edges that had defined our interactions for so long. The cruelty that had once characterized our competition was melting away, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. Rain had become our constant soundtrack, the rhythm that marked our days and nights. Late-night walks to the corner store when we ran out of coffee, standing under the same umbrella with careful distance between our shoulders. The sound of droplets against the windows while we worked at opposite ends of my living room, him grading papers for his teaching assistant position, me wrestling with design concepts for increasingly demanding clients. I began noticing things about him that I had missed before, or maybe that had changed in the months we hadn't spoken. The way he bit his lip when he was concentrating, a small gesture that made him look younger, less certain. How his laugh, when it came, seemed warmer than I remembered, less performative and more genuine. In the soft glow of desk lamps and the humid scent of damp laundry hanging in the bathroom, something was shifting between us stone by stone. By the second week, something fundamental had shifted between us. The careful politeness that had marked our first few days together began to dissolve, replaced by something that felt both familiar and entirely new. We still challenged each other, still found ourselves on opposite sides of conversations, but the cruelty had melted away, leaving behind something that felt almost like play. It started with small things. He would question my choice of fonts for a client project, not with the surgical precision he had once used to dismantle my presentations, but with genuine curiosity about my design process. I found myself defending my decisions not because I felt attacked, but because I wanted him to understand the thinking behind them. Our debates stretched into the evening, conducted over takeout containers and the glow of my laptop screen, voices animated but no longer sharp. The rain continued its relentless presence, turning our world into something intimate and enclosed. We developed routines around it, patterns that felt both necessary and chosen. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, while we listened to the weather reports that always promised more of the same. Evening walks to the corner store, standing close under my small umbrella, our shoulders brushing in a way that felt accidental, but somehow inevitable. I started noticing the way he moved through my space, how he had learned to navigate the narrow hallway without disturbing the stack of books I kept meaning to organize. He folded his blanket each morning with military precision, transforming my couch back into a piece of furniture rather than a makeshift bed. But small signs of his presence remained. A coffee mug in the sink that wasn't mine, his jacket hanging on the hook by the door, the way my apartment smelled faintly different now, like someone else had been living there. One afternoon, I was struggling to carry presentation boards down to my car for a client meeting, the kind of unwieldy portfolio cases that seemed designed to be carried by someone with 3 arms. I was halfway down the stairs, fighting with the wind and trying not to let the rain damage my work, when Ezra appeared beside me. He didn't ask if I needed help or comment on my obvious struggle. He simply took half the load, lifting the heaviest boards with the same quiet efficiency he had once brought to our academic competitions. We loaded everything into my car in silence, both of us getting soaked in the process, but working with a coordination that surprised me. When we got back upstairs, both dripping and slightly breathless, I found myself thanking him more warmly than I had intended. He shrugged it off, disappearing into the bathroom to change out of his wet clothes, but I caught something in his expression before he turned away, a softness that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. The next evening, I noticed the small rip in his jacket, the one he had been wearing the day he showed up at my door. It was barely visible, just a tiny tear along the seam where the sleeve met the shoulder, but it bothered me in ways I couldn't quite explain. Without really thinking about it, I asked if he wanted me to fix it. He looked surprised, almost suspicious, as if he were trying to figure out what I might want in return. But he handed over the jacket, settling onto the opposite end of the couch while I worked. My sewing skills were basic at best, learned from necessity and supplemented by online tutorials, but I found myself taking extra care with the stitches, aware that he was watching me. The silence while I worked felt different from our earlier awkwardness. There was something almost meditative about the rhythm of needle through fabric, the rain creating a steady backdrop against the windows. When I handed the jacket back to him, our fingers brushed for just a moment, and I felt something electric pass between us that I wasn't ready to name. These small acts of care became part of our routine. I would make extra coffee in the morning, enough for both of us. He would pick up groceries on his way home from campus, always including something I had mentioned running out of. We began cooking together more often, not out of financial necessity, but because it felt natural, comfortable in a way that surprised us both. Our conversations during these shared meals grew longer, more substantial. He told me about the classes he was teaching, the frustrations of trying to engage undergraduates who seemed more interested in their phones than in literature. I found myself describing the challenges of freelance work, the isolation of spending days communicating only through email, the way client feedback could feel like personal rejection. I began noticing things about him that I had missed during all our months of competition. The way he bit his lip when he was thinking, a small gesture that made him look younger and less certain than the confident rival I had built up in my mind. How his laugh, when it came, felt genuine rather than performative, warm in a way that seemed to fill the small space of my apartment. One night, we found ourselves studying at opposite ends of my living room, the soft light of desk lamps creating pools of warmth in the darkness. He was grading student papers, making notes in the margins with the kind of careful attention that spoke to how seriously he took his teaching responsibilities. I was working on a logo design that had been giving me trouble for days, trying different approaches that all felt wrong somehow. The quiet rhythm of rain against the windows, the scratches pen on paper, the soft clicking of my stylus against my tablet. It all felt remarkably peaceful, domestic in a way that should have alarmed me, but instead felt like something I had been missing without knowing it. When I looked up and caught him watching me work, something passed between us in the lamplight, an acknowledgement of how far we had traveled from that night in February when harsh words had burned bridges I thought could never be rebuilt. The wall between us was crumbling, stone by stone, replaced by something fragile and new. It happened on a Friday night, 3 weeks after he had first appeared at my door. We had fallen into the habit of weekend movie marathons, partly because neither of us had anywhere else to be, and partly because my laptop screen provided a safe focal point for our attention, something to look at besides each other. I had picked up a bottle of wine from the corner store, nothing expensive, just something to mark the end of another week. We had been working our way through a collection of films I had downloaded months ago, but never found time to watch, old movies with complicated plots and black and white cinematography that demanded attention. The wine made everything softer around the edges. Our conversation became more meandering, less guarded, touching on subjects we had previously avoided. He told me about his childhood in a small town I had never heard of, where the nearest bookstore was 40 miles away and ambition was viewed with suspicion. I found myself describing the pressure I felt from my parents, who had sacrificed to send me to college and expected returns on their investment in the form of a stable career and conventional success. We were sitting on my couch, closer than we had been in weeks, the laptop balanced on a stack of books between us. The third film of the night was something atmospheric and slow-moving, the kind of movie that works better as background than as active entertainment. I was more aware of him beside me than of what was happening on screen, the warmth radiating from his body, the way he had let his guard down as the evening progressed. When his head began to drift toward my shoulder, I told myself it was just the wine, just fatigue from a long week. But when his weight finally settled against me, temple resting against the curve where my shoulder met my neck, something inside my chest began to race. I tried to focus on the film, on the conversation between characters I couldn't quite follow, but my entire awareness had narrowed to the point where his hair brushed against my skin. He was warm and solid beside me, his breathing steady and deep, and I realized he had fallen asleep. The smart thing would have been to wake him, to suggest he move to his usual spot on the couch, to maintain the careful distance we had been negotiating for weeks. Instead, I found myself sitting perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had settled over us. His hair was softer than I had expected, dark and slightly damp from the shower he had taken earlier. Without really thinking about it, I let my fingers hover just above the surface, close enough to feel the warmth but not quite touching. The urge to actually make contact was almost overwhelming, but I held back, suspended between desire and the fear of crossing a line we couldn't uncross. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. The film continued playing, but I had lost track of the plot entirely. All of my attention had focused on this one point of contact, the weight of his head against my shoulder, the rhythm of his breathing, the way this simple proximity felt both terrifying and inevitable. When I finally gave in and let my fingers brush against his hair, just barely, he didn't pull away. If anything, he seemed to settle deeper in his sleep, turning slightly, so that more of his weight rested against me. The gesture felt unconscious, natural, as if his body had been waiting for permission to trust mine. The realization bloomed slowly, like something developing in a darkroom. This person I'd spent so much energy trying to hate, who had challenged and frustrated and pushed me beyond my comfort zone, was the same person who now felt like safety incarnate pressed against my side. The boy I had thought was my enemy was the only one who felt like home. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened to reshape everything I thought I knew about our relationship, about myself, about what I wanted from life. I had spent months convincing myself that I was better off without the competition, without the constant pressure to be sharper, better, more original. But sitting here with him asleep against my shoulder, I realized how much I had missed the way he made me feel fully awake, fully present in my own life. The film reached its conclusion without my notice, the credits rolling across the screen in silence. I should have woken him then, should have suggested we call a night, should have restored the careful boundaries that had made cohabitation possible. Instead, I found myself memorizing the moment, the weight of him against me, the scent of his shampoo, the way the lamplight caught in his hair. When he finally stirred, consciousness returning gradually, I felt him tense slightly as he realized where he was. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room had grown quiet except for the rain, which had returned with renewed intensity, drumming against the windows like it was trying to get inside. He lifted his head slowly, and our eyes met in the dim light cast by my desk lamp. No words were spoken, but something passed between us in that look, something heavy and electric and impossible to ignore. It was acknowledgement and question and answer all at once. The recognition that whatever had been building between us for weeks had just crossed into territory neither of us had planned to explore. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I could see my own uncertainty reflected in his eyes, the same mixture of want and fear that was making my heart race. We were balanced on the edge of something that could either ruin us both or finally make sense of everything that had happened since that night in February. He didn't move away, and neither did I. We just looked at each other across the small distance that separated us, both of us breathing carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile understanding had just taken shape between us. Outside, the rain continued its relentless rhythm, wrapping us in a cocoon of sound and intimacy, holding us suspended in this moment of recognition that felt both inevitable and impossible to believe. 3 days after that Friday night, Ezra told me he had found another place to stay. He mentioned it casually over morning coffee, the way someone might comment on the weather or announce they were running low on milk. A friend across town had offered him a couch, something more permanent than the temporary arrangement we had stumbled into. He could move out by the weekend if that worked for me. I forced a smile that felt like swallowing glass, nodding as if this were the natural conclusion to a situation that had always been meant to be temporary. Of course, I said. That makes sense. You probably want your own space again. But even as I spoke the words, something was breaking apart inside my chest. The apartment that had felt small and cramped when he first arrived now seemed impossibly large at the prospect of his absence. I found myself cataloging all the small ways his presence had changed the space. The second coffee mug in the sink each morning, the way my shower curtain hung slightly different after he used the bathroom, the indent his body had left in the couch cushions. He nodded, seeming almost relieved that I had taken the news so well. He started talking about logistics, about when he would pack his few belongings, about how grateful he was for my hospitality during what he called a difficult transition. His voice carried the same polite distance that had marked our first few days together, as if the intimacy of recent weeks had been something I had imagined. I spent the rest of that day trying to convince myself this was for the best. We had been living in an artificial bubble, thrown together by circumstance rather than choice. Whatever I thought I had felt on Friday night was probably just loneliness, just the human need for connection, misinterpreting proximity for something deeper. It would be easier to return to our separate lives, to the carefully maintained distance that had worked well enough before. But that night, lying in bed listening to him move around the living room as he prepared to sleep on my couch for one of the last times, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake by letting him go. The rain that had been our constant companion for weeks returned with a vengeance that Tuesday, the kind of downpour that turned streets into rivers and made being outside feel like swimming through air. I spent the evening working on a logo design that refused to come together, watching water stream down my windows, and wondering if the weather was reflecting my mood or if I was projecting my internal state onto the natural world. Just after midnight, when I was finally ready to admit defeat and go to bed, there was another knock at my door. This time, I knew who it would be before I looked through the peephole. Ezra stood there again, soaked through just as he had been that first night 3 weeks ago, hair plastered to his forehead, clothes clinging to his frame. But something was different in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, as if he were carrying himself with a kind of determined resignation. When I opened the door, he was already shaking his head, water dripping from his jacket onto my doormat. He said he couldn't leave. Not like this. Not without telling me something first. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart hammering against my ribs with a rhythm that seemed to match the rain against my windows. He stood in the center of my living room, in almost the exact same spot where he had stood that first night, but this time he didn't wait for me to offer him a towel or make tea or create the comfortable buffer of small tasks. His voice was unsteady as he began to speak, words tumbling out as if he had been rehearsing them for days, but still couldn't quite get them right. He told me that the last few weeks had been the first time in months that he had felt like himself. The first time since our argument in February that he had been able to sleep through the night without replaying every harsh word we had exchanged. He said that leaving my apartment to move in with his friend felt like running away from the one good thing that had come out of an otherwise terrible semester. He had tried to convince himself that staying was complicated, that we had too much history to make this work, that whatever was happening between us was just gratitude or convenience or proximity masquerading as something deeper. But walking away felt like betraying the person he had become over the past 3 weeks, the version of himself that had emerged when we stopped treating each other like enemies and started treating each other like human beings worthy of care. I found myself holding my breath as he spoke, afraid that any sound from me might break his momentum or cause him to reconsider what he was saying. His confession felt fragile, like something that could shatter if I responded wrong, if I misunderstood what he was offering. He talked about the night I had fallen asleep against his shoulder, how he had been aware of my fingers in his hair, even in his drowsiness, how the gesture had felt like permission to want something he had been afraid to name. He described the way our arguments had evolved from weapons into conversation, how cooking dinner together had become the highlight of his days, how my presence had transformed his understanding of what home could feel like. When he finally stopped talking, the silence that followed felt dense with possibility. Rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, wrapping us in the same cocoon of sound and intimacy that had become the soundtrack to our strange courtship. I realized I was standing frozen by the door, still wearing the expression of polite surprise I had put on when I first saw him on my doorstep. But everything inside me was racing, every careful wall I had built around my feelings crumbling in the face of his honesty. This could ruin us both, I thought. Or it could be the truth we had been circling since that first night, the answer to questions we had been too afraid to ask. I looked at him standing there, drenched and shivering and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him, offering me something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The choice was mine now, the decision that would determine whether we stepped forward into unknown territory or retreated back to the safety of distance and familiar antagonism. Slowly, carefully, I stepped aside and gestured for him to come deeper into the apartment, away from the door, away from the possibility of leaving again. I woke to silence. For the first time in weeks, there was no rain drumming against my windows, no steady rhythm marking the hours or wrapping my apartment in its cocoon of sound. The absence felt profound, like waking up to find that gravity had reversed itself overnight. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains, casting everything in soft gold. I lay still for a moment, letting consciousness return gradually, aware that something fundamental had shifted in the night, but not yet ready to examine what that meant. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, rich and familiar, but somehow different. Not the hurried, utilitarian brewing I usually managed in the mornings, but something more deliberate, more careful. I could hear quiet movement, the soft clink of mugs against countertops, the gentle hiss of steam that meant someone was taking time to do things properly. I found him standing in my kitchen window, 2 mugs steaming on the counter beside him, looking out at the street below where everything gleamed with leftover rain. Sunlight caught in his hair, turning the dark strands almost bronze. And for a moment, I just watched him, this person who had become so central to my world that I couldn't remember what the apartment had felt like before he arrived. He was wearing the shirt he had borrowed from me the night before, still damp from the rain, and somehow the sight of him in my clothes felt more intimate than anything that had happened between us. He looked settled, comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the physical space and everything to do with something more fundamental. When he noticed me in the doorway, he smiled, the kind of expression that starts small and spreads gradually reaching his eyes in a way that made my chest tighten with something that might have been relief or gratitude or simple recognition of how right this felt. He handed me one of the mugs, and our fingers brushed as I took it, a moment of contact that lasted just slightly longer than necessary. The coffee was perfect, stronger than I usually made it, but exactly the way I actually preferred it, as if he had been paying attention to details I hadn't even realized I was revealing. We stood there in comfortable silence, both looking out the window at the world that was slowly awakening outside. The streets were still shining with yesterday's rain, reflecting the early light like mirrors, but everything felt different now. Cleaner, somehow, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust and debris. There were no grand declarations that morning, no dramatic conversations about what had changed between us or what it meant for the future. Instead, there was just this quiet certainty, the sense that we had finally stopped fighting against something that had always been inevitable. I watched him move around my kitchen as if he belonged there, refilling our mugs, rinsing the coffee pot, performing the small domestic rituals that somehow felt more significant than any words we might have spoken. His presence had transformed the space from something that was simply mine into something that was ours, though neither of us had said that out loud. When I checked my phone, there were 3 missed calls from the client whose logo design I was supposed to deliver that morning. The real world was already intruding, demanding attention and professional competence and all the things that had filled my life before this strange interlude began. But somehow the pressure felt manageable now, like something I could handle rather than something that might overwhelm me. Ezra noticed me scrolling through emails and offered to help with whatever I was working on, the same quiet efficiency he had brought to carrying my portfolio cases, but applied now to the daily mechanics of freelance work. He proofread client correspondence, organized files, made suggestions about presentation formats with the same attention to detail that had once made him such a formidable academic rival. Working together felt natural in a way that surprised me. There was no competition now, no need to prove who was sharper or more creative or more capable of impressing professors or clients. Instead, there was collaboration, the kind of partnership that made both of us better at what we were doing. Outside, the world carried on exactly as it always had. Buses rumbled down the street, their engines creating a low background hum that replaced the rain as our soundtrack. Students hurried past on the sidewalk below, backpacks slung over shoulders, probably late for classes or jobs or the 1,000 small obligations that filled college life. But inside my apartment, everything had shifted into something new and uncertain and impossibly fragile. We moved around each other with the careful choreography of people learning to share space not out of necessity, but out of choice, finding rhythms that accommodated both of our needs without either of us having to surrender too much of ourselves. When Ezra asked if I wanted him to pick up groceries on his way back from campus that afternoon, the question felt loaded with implications we weren't quite ready to discuss. He wasn't just asking about dinner. He was asking about tomorrow and the day after that, and whether this new configuration of our lives was something we wanted to maintain. I said yes, and meant it, and felt something settle in a place that I hadn't even realized had been unsteady. The morning stretched ahead of us, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. There would be work to finish, emails to send, the practical necessities of 2 people figuring out how to build a life together from the fragments of what they had been separately. But for now, there was just this: sunlight through the windows, the taste of perfectly brewed coffee, and the quiet weight of something new settling between us like a promise we were both finally ready to keep.